19 years old, and she had nowhere left to sleep but the floor of a feed store that wasn't even hers. Her name was Adeline Voss, and by the autumn of 1881, she had lost her mother to fever, her father to a mining accident, and her home to an uncle named Garrett Voss, who decided a girl alone wasn't worth the roof over her head. He sold the family claim out from under her before the ground on her father's grave had even settled, and he handed her $11, what he called her share, as if that erased 15 years of her life. $11 and a bundle of her mother's quilts were all she owned in the world. So when she heard that a collapsed, rusted-out miner's hut on the far edge of Copper Hollow, Colorado, was being auctioned off for scrap for the price of $10, she didn't hesitate, though every person who watched her hand over that money believed they were watching a girl throw away her very last chance at survival. What none of them knew, what even Adeline herself did not yet know, was that behind a false wall in that condemned little shack sat a secret that had been waiting 11 years to be found, a secret that would not only save her life, but would end up rebuilding an entire town that everyone had already given up for dead. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Voss. If you have ever been told that you were worth nothing more than the scraps left behind, we hope this story finds you, and we'd love to hear in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Adeline had been raised the daughter of a blacksmith, and there is a particular kind of woman forged in the heat of a smithy, not hardened, exactly, but tempered, the way good steel is tempered so that it bends before it breaks. Her father, Thomas Voss, had run the only forge in Copper Hollow for 18 years, a squat brick building at the crossroads where the road to Denver met the trail up to the silver claims. And from the time Adeline could walk, she had been at his side, pumping the bellows, sorting nails, learning the particular music a horseshoe makes when it is heated exactly right. Her mother, Ruth, had been a quieter presence, but no less formidable. A woman who kept the ledgers for half the town's tradesmen, because she was the only one who could make the numbers behave, and who taught Adeline her letters using the Bible and the newspaper in equal measure. It was Ruth who used to say, when Adeline complained that some task was beneath her, that nothing built by an honest hand is beneath anyone, and nothing given by a dishonest one is worth having. Adeline did not understand the weight of those words until many years later, but she carried them the way she carried her mother's sewing thimble, tucked always close. Copper Hollow itself was not a wealthy town, not by the standards of the grander mining cities like Leadville or Central City, but had once been a hopeful one. It sat in a fold of the Rockies where two creeks met, ringed by aspen and lodgepole pine, and for a decade the Silver Crown mine up on Widow's Ridge had kept nearly every family fed. There was a mercantile run by a stern Norwegian named Ole Halvorsen, a church with a bell that had been hauled up from Missouri by ox cart, a schoolhouse where Adeline had learned alongside the children of miners and merchants alike, and a saloon that doubled, on Sundays, as the only building large enough for town meetings. Adeline knew every face on that street, knew which dog belonged to which porch, knew the particular squeak of the mercantile's door and the smell of tallow candles from the chandler's shop. It was in every way that mattered to a girl of 13 or 14, the whole of the world. But even a hopeful town can rot from the inside, and the rot in Copper Hollow had a name: Garrett Voss, her father's younger brother. Garrett had never taken to the forge the way Thomas had. He preferred the feel of cards in his hands to the feel of hammers, and by the time Adeline was old enough to notice such things, her uncle had become the sort of man other men whispered about outside the saloon, a man who lent money at terrible rates to desperate miners, and who always, somehow, ended up owning a little more of the town each year. Thomas had tried, gently, for years, to bring his brother back into honest work, and it was this stubborn family loyalty, this refusal to believe that blood could truly turn to poison, that would cost Adeline everything. When Thomas Voss was killed in the spring of 1881, crushed beneath a collapsed support beam, while shoring up a tunnel he had no business being in except that a friend had asked for his help. Adeline was 17. Ruth followed him into the ground 8 months later, taken by a fever that swept through the hollow that winter and took 6 other souls with her, mostly children and the old. Adeline nursed her mother through the worst of it with cool cloths and willow bark tea, sitting up 3 nights running without sleep, And it was in those last hours that Ruth pressed the thimble into her daughter's palm and made her promise one thing: that whatever happened, Adeline would never let anyone convince her that she was worth less than what she truly was. Adeline promised. She did not yet know how hard that promise would be to keep. Garrett Voss appeared at the funeral wearing a black coat that fit too well for a man who claimed hard times, and within 2 weeks he had produced papers, real or forged. Adeline never determined which, since she had no money for a lawyer to challenge them, showing that Thomas had mortgaged the forge and the small house behind it to cover a supposed debt to his brother. The forge, the tools, the house where Adeline had been born, all of it passed to Garrett with a speed that left the whole town murmuring, though no one murmured loud enough to actually stand against him, because half of Copper Hollow owed Garrett money too, and fear has a way of making silence look like agreement. Garrett gave Adeline $11, told her a girl her age ought to find work as a domestic in Denver, and had her belongings set out on the porch within the week. She packed what she could into a single trunk: her mother's quilts, her father's smaller hand tools that Garrett hadn't bothered to inventory, a Bible, the thimble, and she walked away from the only home she had ever known with her chin level and her eyes dry, because she had decided somewhere in that long walk down Main Street that she would not give Garrett Voss the satisfaction of her tears. For 3 weeks, she slept where she could, a night in the hayloft above Halvorson's Mercantile, when Ole took pity on her and didn't ask questions, 2 nights on the hard floor of the feed store belonging to a kind but poor widow named Mrs. Petrov, who fed her broth she could not really spare. Adeline took in mending, split kindling for anyone who would pay a nickel, and watched her $11 dwindle to 9, then 7, then 5, and she understood with the cold clarity of the truly desperate that she needed a roof of her own before winter closed the mountain passes. Because a homeless girl in a Colorado winter was a girl who did not always survive to see spring at IT was Mrs. Petrov, in fact, who first mentioned the old Kessler hut. Ugly little thing, the widow said, working a needle through a torn shirt collar, sitting up past the old spur line, been empty since Silas Kessler wandered off, or died, or whatever it is that happened to him. County's been meaning to knock it down for scrap lumber for years. There's talk they'll finally auction it off, just to be rid of the taxes on the lot. Adeline had walked past that hut 100 times as a child, always given it a wide berth the way children give wide berths to anything the adults call cursed or unlucky, and she remembered it now as a slumping, rust-streaked shape half swallowed by chokecherry brush, its tin roof peeled back like the lid of a sardine can. It was, by any sane measure, worthless. And so, naturally, it was exactly what a person with almost nothing could afford. The auction was held on a gray Tuesday morning outside the county clerk's office in the county seat of Marlborough, a half-day's walk from Copper Hollow, and Adeline made that walk in boots with soles worn thin as paper, arriving just as the clerk, a bored man named Whitfield, was reading out the lot number. There were perhaps 8 people gathered, mostly men hoping to strip the tin roof and the iron stove for salvage. And when the bidding opened at $3, Adeline's heart had sunk, certain she would be outbid within seconds by someone with real money. But the men lost interest quickly once they realized the roof was mostly rusted through and the stove long gone, cannibalized by some earlier scavenger, and the bidding stalled at $8. Adeline, standing at the back in her patched wool coat, heard herself say 9 before she had entirely decided to say it, and then, when a heavy-set man in a fur cap grumbled 10 more out of stubbornness than desire, Adeline said 10 and 50 cents with a steadiness that surprised even her, and the man simply laughed, shook his head, and walked off toward the saloon, muttering that the girl was welcome to that pile of rust. The gavel came down. $10.50 for a structure that most of Marlborough considered an eyesore not worth the match it would take to burn it properly, and Adeline Voss, homeless at 19, walked away that day as the sole and legal owner of a rusted, sagging, forgotten hut on the edge of a dying mining town, and every soul who watched her sign the paper believed, quite reasonably, that she had just spent the last of her money on absolutely nothing at all. She walked the whole way back to Copper Hollow that afternoon with the deed folded carefully into her mother's Bible, and when she finally stood in front of the Kessler hut as its rightful owner, the reality of what she had done settled over her like the cold mountain shadow already creeping across the valley. The door hung crooked on one leather hinge, and when she pushed it open, dust and the papery husks of dead moths sifted down from the rafters. The single room inside smelled of rust and mouse droppings and something faintly mineral, like the inside of the mine shafts her father used to describe. Sunlight came through the ruined roof in long, dusty shafts, illuminating a floor of packed dirt, a single collapsed shelf, and, in the corner, an old iron-cot frame with no mattress, its springs gone orange with rust. It was, by any measure, a shelter only in the most technical sense, offering little more protection from the coming winter than sleeping under a pine tree would have. But it was hers. No uncle could take it. No landlord could put her belongings on a porch. For the first time in weeks, Adeline sat down on the dirt floor of that ruined hut and allowed herself, finally, to cry. Not from despair, but from something closer to relief, the strange relief of having hit the very bottom and found, at least, solid ground there. She spent that first night wrapped in her mother's quilts, listening to the wind find every gap in the walls, and it was in the gray hour before dawn, unable to sleep for the cold, that she noticed something odd about the north wall of the hut. The other 3 walls were built the way any prospector's shack was built, rough-sawn planks nailed directly to a simple frame, warped and gapped with age. But the north wall had a strange thickness to it, a shallow false depth, as though a second layer of boards had been fitted a few inches in front of the true wall, creating a narrow hollow space between them. She noticed at first only because the north wall did not let in the same needling drafts the others did. It seemed, oddly, to be the one section of that ruined hut that had been built with actual care, curiosity, and the particular restlessness of a woman with nothing left to lose, drove her to investigate that very morning. Using her father's small crowbar, one of the tools Garrett had overlooked when he cleared the forge, she pried gently at the base of the north wall's boards, and after some stubborn resistance from 13 years of rust and swelling, one plank came free with a groan. Behind it was not insulation, not simple empty space, but a narrow cavity perhaps 8 inches deep running the full width of the wall, and tucked within that cavity, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and was now a brittle, cracked husk, sat a wooden box no bigger than a bread loaf, and beside it, astonishingly, 3 canvas mining sacks, heavy enough that Adeline nearly dropped one when she first lifted it free. Her hands trembled as she worked the rusted clasp of the wooden box. Inside, protected somewhat by the oilcloth, she found a bundle of papers, a journal, its leather cover cracked, but its pages largely intact, written in a small, careful, slanting hand, along with several folded documents that looked, from their formal script and wax-cracked seals, like legal instruments of some kind. And in the mining sacks, when she finally worked up the courage to untie the stiff cord, she found not gold, as her wildest half-formed hope had suggested, but something almost stranger, raw silver or, high-grade by the look of the dark, heavy veins running through the rock, easily 200 pounds of it distributed between the 3 sacks, or that any assayer in Marlborough would recognize immediately as coming from a rich vein indeed. The journal belonged, as Adeline discovered over the following days of careful reading by candlelight, to Silas Kessler himself, the very man for whom the hut was named, a prospector who had come to Copper Hollow 11 years before Adeline's birth and staked a claim on Widow's Ridge that he called, with the plain honesty of a working man, the Kessler Lode. But the journal told a story that had never reached the ears of the town, a story of betrayal that ran parallel, in an eerie and painful way, to Adeline's own. Silas had discovered his rich vein of silver in 1868, and rather than risk having it stolen or jumped by claim raiders, a common enough danger in those wild years, he had partnered quietly with a young lawyer newly arrived in the territory, a man he trusted enough to hold his claim papers and arrange proper registration in Marlborough. That lawyer's name, written plainly in Silas Kessler's careful hand, was Garrett Voss. Adeline had to read the name 3 times before she trusted her own eyes. According to the journal, Garrett, then a struggling young attorney rather than the moneylender he would later become, had taken Silas's claim papers to Marlborough to file them properly, and had instead filed them under his own name, And when Silas discovered the betrayal and confronted him, Garrett had threatened to have him arrested on a fabricated charge of claim fraud, using his position and his growing web of debts and favors to intimidate the older, less educated prospector into silence. Silas, frightened and alone, had hidden the he'd already extracted, hidden his own copy of the original claim documents, the ones proving the true date of discovery and his rightful ownership. Behind that false wall, he built himself with unusual care for a man in a hurry, and he had written in his journal that he intended to travel to the territorial capital to file a formal legal challenge once he had gathered enough evidence and enough courage. The journal ended abruptly in October of 1870, mid-sentence, and Silas Kessler was never seen in Copper Hollow again. Whether he had been driven off, or worse, the journal could not say, and the town had simply assumed, as towns do, that another prospector had wandered on to try his luck elsewhere. Adeline sat with that knowledge for a long, cold night. The papers spread across her lap in the candlelight, and understood with a dawning, sick clarity that the man who had stolen a dying prospector's silver claim 11 years before was the very same man who had stolen her father's forge and thrown her out into the street. Garrett Voss had built his entire fortune, his money-lending, his growing ownership of half the hollow, on ground that legally still belonged, according to these very documents, to Silas Kessler or his rightful heirs, and by extension, if Kessler had no heirs, potentially to whoever now held both the claim documents and the physical evidence of the vein itself. She did not sleep again that night. Instead, she read every document in that box 3 times over. Kessler's original claim registration dated a full 4 months before Garrett's fraudulent filing. A hand-drawn survey map of Widow's Ridge marking the vein's location with careful excess. A letter Silas had begun but never finished addressed to the Territorial Land Office in Denver. It was, she realized with something between terror and fierce hope, enough evidence to unravel Garrett Voss's entire empire. If only she could get it into the right hands before he learned it existed and destroyed it, or destroyed her along with it. The trouble, of course, was that Adeline Voss was a homeless 19-year-old girl with a scandalous family connection to the very man she needed to expose, while Garrett was a respected, if quietly feared, businessman with friends among the county clerks and, she suspected, at least one judge in Marlboro. Simply walking into the land office with a dead man's journal would invite laughter at best and violence at worst, especially once Garrett learned who was making the accusation. She needed proof beyond the papers. She needed the physical vein itself examined. She needed an assayer's honest report on the ore, and she needed, above all, someone in a position of respect willing to stand beside her when she made her claim. She thought first of Ole Halvorsen, who had given her shelter in his hayloft, and who, she knew, harbored no love for Garrett Voss, having lost a considerable sum to one of Garrett's punishing loans 2 winters back. She went to him not with the whole truth at first, but with the ore's samples, asking simply whether he knew an honest assayer in Marlboro who wouldn't run straight to Garrett with news of what she'd found. Ole, turning one of the heavy ore chunks over in his weathered hands, went very quiet and then very serious, and told her there was a man named Frederick Nash, semi-retired now, who had assayed half the claims in the county in his younger years and who despised Garrett Voss with a particular passion Ole didn't elaborate on but promised was well-earned. It took Adeline nearly 2 weeks of careful, quiet work to build her case, staying in the Kessler hut by night, patching the roof herself with scrap tin she scavenged from an abandoned line shack, chinking the walls with mud and dried grass the way she'd seen her father do to the forge's chimney once, learning in the doing of it that her hands, her father's daughter's hands, knew more about honest construction than she had ever given herself credit for. By day, she traveled a half-day walk to Marlboro whenever she could, meeting with old Frederick Nash in the back room of his modest home, where he examined the ore samples with a jeweler's loupe and pronounced them, with something like reverent astonishment, among the richest silver ore he had assayed in 20 years of practice. When she finally showed him Kessler's journal and the claim documents, laying out the whole sorry history of theft and threat, Nash sat very still for a long moment, and then told her something that changed the entire shape of her fight. He had known Silas Kessler personally, had in fact assayed his very first samples back in 1868, and had always harbored deep suspicion about the man's sudden disappearance and Garrett Voss's equally sudden prosperity that same year. He agreed, without hesitation, to examine the physical claim boundary on Widow's Ridge and to prepare a formal, sworn assayer's report. Evidence, finally, that could not be laughed out of a courtroom. Word of Adeline's activity did not stay hidden for long in a town as small as Copper Hollow, and it was perhaps inevitable that Garrett Voss himself would eventually hear whispers that his cast-off niece was asking strange questions about the old Kessler claim, and had been seen twice in the company of Frederick Nash, a man whose long-ago suspicions Garrett had thought safely buried along with whatever had become of Silas Kessler. He came to the hut himself on a bitter afternoon in late November, his fine black coat incongruous against the rough-patched shack, and he did not bother with pleasantries. "You'd do well," he told her, standing in the doorway, so that his shadow fell across her makeshift table, "to remember whose charity kept you from starving these past months." Adeline, who had learned from her mother exactly how to hold her ground without raising her voice, did not stand, only looked up at him and said that $11 was not charity, it was the smallest fraction of what he had already stolen from her, and that she had recently learned he had a considerable talent for stealing from honest men, going back a good deal further than her father's forge. Something in Garrett's face went very still and very cold at that, and he told her, with the particular quiet menace of a man used to being obeyed, that whatever wild story she thought she'd invented about an old drunk who wandered off 11 years ago would not be believed by any judge in the territory, and that she would find herself the one facing charges of trespassing, of theft, of slander, if she continued down this road. Then he left, and Adeline understood that she had very little time left before he moved to protect himself by whatever means necessary, and that a man who had likely already made one inconvenient prospector disappear might not hesitate to try something similar with an inconvenient niece. She sent word that very night, through a trusted young writer named Caleb Whitmore, who delivered feed for Mrs. Petrov's store, asking Frederick Nash to come as quickly as he could with whatever evidence he had gathered, and asking Ole Halvorsen to spread quiet word among the townsfolk that a town meeting of real importance would be needed at the church on Sunday, though she did not yet say why, only that it concerned the truth about Widow's Ridge and every soul in Copper Hollow who had ever owed Garrett Voss a debt. That Sunday, the church that had once held only quiet prayers and Christmas services was packed tighter than Adeline had ever seen it, curiosity and rumor having done exactly the work she'd hoped, and when she stood at the front of that congregation, 19 years old, in a patched wool coat, holding a dead man's journal in trembling hands, she told the whole town the story of Silas Kessler, of the true discovery date on Widow's Ridge, of Garrett's fraudulent filing and his threats, and she watched faces she had known her whole life shift from skepticism to shock to a slow, dawning fury as Frederick Nash stood beside her and confirmed, in his measured professional voice, that he had personally examined the ridge that week and found the vein exactly where Kessler's hand-drawn map indicated it would be, still yielding or of exceptional richness, or that Garrett Voss had been quietly extracting and selling for over a decade under a false claim. Garrett, seated near the back with two of his hired men flanking him, rose to denounce the whole affair as the desperate fantasy of a bitter girl, but his voice cracked in a way it never had before, and when old Mrs. Petrov stood up from her pew and said, in her thick, unhurried accent, that she had always wondered why Silas Kessler's dog had been found tied up and starving behind Garrett's old law office the week the prospector vanished, a detail she had simply never thought to connect until this moment. A heavy and dangerous silence fell over that church, and Adeline watched her uncle's composure finally shatter into something like fear. The legal reckoning that followed took the better part of the next year, and it was neither swift nor simple, but Frederick Nash's sworn report and Silas Kessler's own carefully dated journal proved impossible for even a friendly county judge to entirely ignore, especially once 3 other families came forward, emboldened by Adeline's stand, to reveal their own dealings with Garrett's fraudulent loan papers and forged debts. The Territorial Land Office in Denver eventually ruled that the Kessler lode's true and rightful ownership, absent any surviving Kessler heirs after an exhaustive search turned up none, defaulted under territorial law to whoever held the original claim documents and had brought the fraud to light, which was to say, it defaulted to Adeline Voss herself. Garrett Voss was stripped of the claim, fined heavily for the fraudulent filing. And though he escaped imprisonment through a combination of clever lawyering and a quiet influence he still held over one judge, he was ruined in every way that mattered to a man like him. His moneylending business collapsed as debtors realized his hold over them had always rested on forged paper, and he left Copper Hollow within a year, disappearing west with what little remained of his reputation, never to trouble the town again. Adeline did not keep the Kessler lode's fortune for herself, not in any way that resembled the hoarding, grasping manner of the man who had stolen it in the first place. She paid Frederick Nash generously for his time and his courage. She settled every family's fraudulent debt to Garrett's old moneylending scheme out of her own new wealth. She rebuilt her father's forge from the ground up on its original site, larger and finer than before, and staffed it with 2 young apprentices from families who could not otherwise have afforded such training. She funded a proper schoolhouse to replace the drafty one-room building where she'd learned her letters. She saw to it that the church bell, cracked now from years of hard winters, was replaced with a fine new one cast in Denver, and she had a modest stone marker placed on Widow's Ridge bearing Silas Kessler's name, and the simple words "honest prospector," wrongly silenced, because she believed, as her mother had taught her, that nothing built by an honest hand should ever be forgotten, and nothing taken by a dishonest one should ever be allowed to stand unchallenged. And the rusted $10 hut itself, the sagging, mouse-eaten shack that every soul in Marlboro had believed the very definition of worthless, Adeline did not tear down. She restored it instead, plank by plank, with her own hands and her father's tools, keeping its crooked doorway and its patch tin roof exactly as they had been, and she used it for the rest of her long life in Copper Hollow as a schoolroom of a different kind, a place where she taught young women exactly what her mother had once taught her: how to read a ledger, how to recognize a fair contract from a fraudulent one, how to hold their ground when someone tried to convince them they were worth less than they truly were. She kept Silas Kessler's journal always on the shelf inside, not hidden this time, but displayed plainly, so that anyone who asked could hear the whole story of how a stolen fortune, hidden for 11 years behind a false wall, had finally found its way home. It is worth remembering, when we tell this story, that Adeline Voss did not become who she was because a rich vein of silver happened to be waiting behind a rotten plank. She became who she was in the $11 her uncle threw at her like garbage, in the nights she slept on borrowed floors, and never once let herself believe the lie that she was disposable in the quiet decision, made with nothing to her name but a dead man's journal and her mother's thimble, that the truth mattered more than her own fear. Homeless at 19, she bought a rusted hut for $10.50 because it was all she had left in the world, and what she found inside it did shock everyone in Copper Hollow, not simply because of the silver, but because of what she chose to do with it, and because a girl the whole town had written off as worth nothing turned out to be the very person who rebuilt it. Thank you for spending this time with Adeline's story. And if her journey moved you, we would be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that they are never truly worthless, no matter what they've been told or how little they seem to have left. We'd love to know, what is a moment in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.